The year was 1878, and the Dakota Territory was a land of sweeping prairies, bone-dry winds, and dreams fading as quickly as the setting sun. On the edge of this harsh and beautiful land stood the Bennett Ranch, once a thriving cattle operation, now withered under years of drought and debt. Clara Bennett pressed her palm to the cool windowpane, gazing out at the brittle fields where grass once danced like green waves. She was 22, her chestnut hair pinned in a simple bun, a smudge of flour on her cheek from preparing the morning biscuits. Her soft grey eyes, usually calm, now held a faint glimmer of worry. In the dusty yard, her father, Edward Bennett, crouched by the corral fence, tightening a loose rail. His once broad shoulders had rounded with the weight of burden, his dark hair streaked with grey long before its time. The ranch had been in their family for 3 generations, but 6 years of drought had emptied the wells, thinned the herds, and chipped away at Edward's pride. The kitchen, behind Clara, was filled with the smells of baking bread and simmering beans. But none of it stirred her appetite. Her gaze was fixed on the lone rider approaching from the road. A bank messenger, she knew, carrying papers that would either break them or demand the impossible. She didn't need to wait for the knock at the door or the polite clearing of the throat. She already knew what was coming. "Morning, Miss Bennett," the messenger said, hat in hand, eyes avoiding hers. He handed over the envelope with a murmured apology. Clara accepted it, feeling the weight of its contents in her palm, like a stone. Edward appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. He took one look at the envelope, and the weariness in his face deepened. "Inside, Clara," he murmured, voice rough. She hesitated. "Pad, inside," Edward repeated, gentler this time. Clara retreated to the kitchen, but she watched from behind the curtains as Edward broke the seal, his lips thinning to a hard line as he read. When he finally came inside, he set the letter down on the table as though it were a coiled rattlesnake. 30 days, he said quietly. $5,000, or we lose it all." Clara sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. We don't have—" "I know," Edward said, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Clara, even if we sold the cattle, the tools, the house," his voice trailed off. For the first time in her life, Clara saw something in her father's face she didn't recognize. Defeat. "Maybe," she offered softly. "We can appeal for more time." Edward let out a bitter laugh. "To Silas Granger. That vulture owns half the county. He doesn't give time, Clara. He takes." 20 miles away, in the heart of Clearwater, Silas Granger swirled brandy in a cut-glass tumbler. His office smelled of polished wood and ambition. At 48, Granger was the kind of man whose mere presence bent a room to his will. His silver-streaked hair was always perfectly combed, his dark suit pressed, his narrow face sharp as a hawk's. "Bennett got the notice?" he asked, not bothering to look up. Victor Hale, Granger's right-hand man, gave a curt nod. "Personally delivered." Granger's thin lips twisted into a smile. "Good. That's spring on Bennett's eastern parcel. Pure gold in this drought. Once we own that land, we control every drop of water from here to the Black Hills." Victor hesitated. "And the girl?" Granger's eyes glinted. "Clara Bennett. She's grown into quite the beauty, hasn't she? Perhaps I'll offer Edward an alternative. Debts can be settled creatively, while men like Granger plotted in polished rooms." Another figure moved silently under the prairie stars. River Hawk crouched near the embers of a dying fire, his dark eyes watching the horizon. At 30, he was a man shaped by 2 worlds, born to a Lakota mother and a white father, straddling the line between cultures that refused to see each other as anything but enemies. His long black hair was tied at the nape of his neck, a single eagle feather woven near his ear. The scars along his forearms spoke of past violence, but his quiet demeanor spoke of restraint. In the Lakota camp sheltered by cottonwoods, elders murmured of soldiers, broken treaties, sickness stealing away the children. River Hawk listened, the weight of their words settling heavy on his chest. He knew the world was tightening like a noose around his people, and yet Clearwater whispered. Of change. There, in the heart of settler territory, power shifted in quiet, cruel ways. Granger's name had reached Riverhawk's ears before, attached to greed and schemes. Now, with news of an auction, and a woman bartered like cattle, Riverhawk's thoughts turned restless. He would go to Clearwater, trade furs, gather medicine, and perhaps, just perhaps, see with his own eyes the storm gathering around the Bennett family. That night, under the pale glow of an oil lamp, Clara sat at the kitchen table, fingers laced, chin resting on her hands. Edward paced near the hearth, his boots scuffing the worn floorboards. "We'll find a way," Clara whispered, though doubt coiled like a snake in her chest. Edward stopped, his shoulders sagging. "There's nothing left to sell, Clara." His voice cracked. "I promised your mother I'd take care of you. And now—" She rose and wrapped her arms around him, feeling the wiry strength that still lingered in his frame. "We're still here, Pa. We're still fighting." But when she lay down that night, alone in the quiet room, her mother once filled with songs and laughter, Clara stared at the ceiling and wondered how long the fight could last. Outside, the prairie wind whispered against the walls, rattling loose boards, slipping through the cracks, like the cold breath of ruin. The sun rose sluggishly over the Dakota plains, casting pale light across the frost-kissed grass. Clara Bennett stood on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching as her father, Edward, harnessed their last good horse to the wagon. His face was set, jaw clenched with a determination. Clara knew masked deep fear. "I'll head into Clearwater," Edward said as he loaded a small crate of pelts, dried beans, and a handful of rusted tools. "Whatever might fetch a few dollars. See if anyone's willing to lend us something." Clara reached out, resting her hand on his arm. "Pass. You don't have to." Edward shook his head. "We can't sit here waiting for the walls to fall in. I won't let him have this ranch without a fight." His voice softened. "Stay close to home, Clara. Watch the herd. I'll be back by nightfall." Clara watched the wagon trundle down the rutted road until it disappeared over the rise. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the dull thud of her heart against her ribs. Every mile her father traveled into Clearwater felt like stepping deeper into a lion's den. The town of Clearwater bustled with the thin, desperate energy of frontier life. Edward guided his wagon down the main street, past weathered storefronts, and the imposing red brick facade of the Granger Bank. Men in broad-brimmed hats leaned against railings, watching with narrowed eyes. Women hurried past with baskets and children in tow. Inside the bank, Silas Granger stood by the window, watching Edward's approach with a faint, amused smile. "He's come, just as I expected," Granger murmured, swirling a finger along the rim of his brandy glass. Victor Hale, standing nearby, tilted his head. "You think he'll offer a deal?" "Oh, Edward Bennett will offer everything he has," Granger said, his voice smooth as silk. "And when that fails, I'll offer him something in return." Edward stood stiffly in front of the massive oak desk, hat in hand, heart hammering in his chest. "Mr. Granger, I've come to discuss my debt." Granger leaned back, steepling his fingers. Edward, always the honest man. Please, sit." "I have a parcel of land east of the ranch," Edward began, voice tight. "Not much, but it has a spring." Granger waved a dismissive hand. "A pittance, Edward. You know it." Edward's throat tightened. "Then, what do you suggest?" Granger rose smoothly, walked to the window, and clasped his hands behind his back. "I've been watching your daughter, Edward." The room seemed to tilt. "She's grown into a remarkable young woman," Granger continued, voice almost gentle. "Beautiful, capable. I'm a widower, as you know, alone, without children." He turned, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. "I propose a solution beneficial to us both. Marry her to me, and your debt disappears." Edward surged to his feet, heart pounding. "You're out of your mind." Granger's smile never wavered. "I'm offering Clara comforts, security, and a future." "What can you offer her, Edward?" "Poverty, ruin, Back at the ranch, Clara swept the porch absently, the rough broom scratching against the boards. She kept glancing toward the horizon, waiting, worrying. The cows in the pasture grazed quietly. The wind rustled through the brittle grass. Somewhere behind her, a screen door creaked, the house settling into its old bones. As afternoon deepened toward evening, a rider crested the far hill. Clara straightened, heart lifting, only to feel it drop again. Her father's shoulders were hunched. His face was pale and pinched, even from a distance. When Edward climbed down from the wagon, Clara met him halfway. "Dad, did anyone?" "No." Edward's voice was raw. "No one has money to spare, and Granger—" His jaw worked, the words fighting to escape. Granger made an offer of his own. Clara's stomach clenched. "What kind of offer?" Edward couldn't meet her eyes. He wants to marry you, Clara." The world seemed to go quiet. Even the wind stilled. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Marry him." Edward reached for her shoulder, but she stepped back, arms wrapped around herself. "You didn't agree." "Of course not." Edward's voice broke. "I told him no, but Clara, he holds all the cards." Clara turned away, fists clenched, trying to push back the storm inside her. 20 miles away, in the Lakota camp, River Hawk packed a bundle of furs into his saddlebags. The council fire flickered low, casting shadows across the weathered faces of the elders. "Be careful, River Hawk," murmured Grey Wolf, the eldest. "You walk in two worlds, but to the white men you will always be your mother's son, not your father's." River Hawk nodded solemnly. "I remember." As he mounted his horse and turned toward Clearwater, his heart pulled him not only toward trade, but toward a mystery he hadn't yet put to words. A restlessness, a sense that something waited on the horizon, ready to break. That night, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, hair unpinned, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. A lamp flickered on the nightstand, casting golden light over the room. Her fingers twisted the hem of her nightdress as her father's words echoed in her mind. Marry Silas Granger, save the ranch, protect her father. But at what cost? Outside, the prairie wind sighed through the eaves, whispering old songs of love, war, and survival. Clara rose and crossed to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, her mother's spirit stirred in the land, watching, waiting. A shape moved along the ridge. A lone rider dark against the moonlit sky. Clara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, her troubles fell away, replaced by a flicker of curiosity, of something unfamiliar sparking to life. The dawn came cold and reluctant, the sun smudging the eastern horizon in pale streaks of gold. Clara rose before the rooster crowed, tying her chestnut hair back into a braid and pulling on her faded blue calico dress. Sleep had not come easily. Each time she closed her eyes, the same thought crept into her mind. Marry Silas Granger. Her stomach knotted at the memory of her father's face the night before, how haunted his eyes had looked, how his hands had trembled as he spoke the unthinkable. Clara moved through the morning chores like a woman underwater. She fed the chickens, checked the well, and carried pails of water to the kitchen, where Edward sat at the table with his head in his hands. "Pa," she murmured gently, setting a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, eyes bleary and lined with exhaustion. "We'll find a way," she whispered, though her own voice trembled with doubt. Edward's hand came up to cover hers, rough and calloused from years of ranch work. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he rasped. "I should have seen this coming." Clara shook her head fiercely. "No, Pa, we're still here. That's what matters." But even as she said the words, she wondered if it was still true. In the town of Clearwater, Silas Granger leaned against the polished counter of the bank, fingers drumming a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Victor Hale watched him from the doorway, arms folded across his chest. "Any word?" Hale asked, one brow raised. Granger's lips curled into a thin smile. "No, But Edward Bennett isn't a fool. He knows his options. Victor stepped forward, lowering his voice. Some of the boys at the saloon are saying the girl's a fighter. They don't think she'll come quietly. Granger's eyes gleamed cold. She will. He poured himself a glass of brandy, lifting it in a silent toast. Every bird in a snare struggles before it goes still. By late afternoon, Edward saddled the horse again. I'm going back into town, he said, adjusting the worn leather strap. Clara gripped the fence post beside her. Pa, please, let me come with you. Edward shook his head. No, Clara. I need to speak with him alone. Maybe there's still another way. Clara's throat tightened. She knew her father's pride. She knew he hated this as much as she did. But desperation was a cruel master. As Edward rode away, Clara pressed her forehead to the rough wood of the corral fence, eyes burning with unshed tears. On the far side of the prairie, River Hawk approached the town with careful eyes. He wore settler clothes now, plain buckskin pants, a tan shirt, boots dusted from the trail. His long black hair was tied back, the eagle feather discreet. To most he passed as a stranger, a drifter, but to those who looked closely, the sharp planes of his face, the set of his dark eyes, told another story. Outside the saloon, two men laughed over their whiskey, voices carrying into the street. Bennett's girl, they're saying Granger's gonna claim her like a prize horse, one sneered.
Mm-hmm.
The other chuckled. Poor Edward. Man can't even save his own kin. Riverhawk's jaw tightened. His people had known this same taste of cruelty, women bartered, families torn apart, honor stripped away. He turned his horse toward the general store, but his mind stayed fixed on the Bennett name. He remembered Edward Bennett well. Years ago, during a brutal winter, Edward had let the Lakota hunt on the edges of his land, had even left food near the woods, when the children's bellies were empty. Now, it seemed, the debt of honor had returned. That evening, Clara waited on the porch, twisting the hem of her apron as the sun sank low. The prairie was awash in crimson and gold, the fields stretching out in silence. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the slow creak of wheels, the soft shuffle of hooves. Edward pulled up, his face pale under his hat. Clara hurried to meet him. Pabber. He climbed down stiffly, avoiding her gaze. We have until the end of the week, he murmured. Then Granger expects an answer. Clara swallowed hard. And if we refuse? Edward's jaw clenched. Then he takes the ranch. We're out on the road by month's end. For a long moment, Clara stared at the ground, watching the dust swirl around her boots. Then she lifted her chin, eyes shining with sudden resolve. Then I'll do it. Edward's head snapped up. No, Clara. She reached out, resting her hand on his arm. It's my choice, Pa. You've carried this burden long enough. His eyes glistened as he gathered her close, his weathered hands trembling. You're so much like your mother, he whispered brokenly. On the road back to camp, Riverhawk watched the moon rise over the hills, pale and full. His horse moved at an easy pace, hooves muffled by the soft dirt. As he neared the edge of town, a sudden stillness settled in his chest. He pulled the reins, narrowing his eyes at the town hall where lanterns flickered in the windows. He could hear the laughter, the clink of glasses, the gathering of men like Granger savoring their power. His fingers brushed the pouch at his waist, where gold nuggets weighed heavily. He had traded for them in the Black Hills, planning to buy medicines for his people. But as he looked toward the glowing windows, another thought crept in. Honor, he thought, and what it demands. In the darkened farmhouse, Clara sat alone by the hearth, her grey eyes fixed on the crackling flames. Edward had gone to bed early, worn thin by sorrow. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, whispering through the gaps like an old ghost. Clara's fingers closed around a locket at her throat, the one her mother had given her on her 12th birthday. She opened it, tracing the tiny image of her mother's smiling face. She closed her eyes. Let me be strong. Let me do what's right. Outside, on the ridge, where prairie met sky. A lone rider paused, his silhouette etched against the moon. The sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the town of Clearwater into shadows and lantern glow. The streets pulsed with a tense excitement. In the heart of town, the Grand Hall stood like a monument to wealth and ambition, its polished wood floors and crystal chandeliers imported from the east. A sharp contrast to the dry, rugged world outside. Inside, men in fine suits and women in silk dresses mingled, laughter and murmured speculation filling the air. The reason they'd gathered was no secret. Silas Granger's invitation had been carefully worded, a celebration of alliance, an engagement announcement, but everyone knew it was something more, a show of power, a claim staked on the last untamed piece of land, and the young woman who came with it. Clara Bennett stood behind a curtain, fingers trembling as they smoothed the emerald silk of the dress Granger had sent her that morning. It felt wrong against her skin, too fine, too heavy, too much like shackles disguised as beauty. Mrs. Dobbins, the town seamstress, bustled around her, tucking pins, patting down fabric. "You're a fortunate girl," Mrs. Dobbins murmured, half to herself. "Many would give anything to marry a man like Mr. Granger." Clara said nothing. Her grey eyes were fixed on a spot on the floor, her mind a storm of thoughts. Edward waited outside the hall, pacing beneath the lanterns, his hat twisting in his hands. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale and drawn. He'd tried to argue with Granger, to plead for a simple engagement announcement. Anything but this. But the banker had only smiled his cold, thin smile. "Of course, Edward," Granger had said smoothly. "A man should always appear generous in victory." Across the town square, River Hawk crouched in the shadows near the livery stable, his dark eyes fixed on the glowing windows of the hall. He had traded his settler's clothing for the dress of his people, soft buckskin leggings, a bone breastplate over his chest, long black hair loose with a single eagle feather fastened near his ear. At his waist hung both a knife and a revolver, not as a threat, but as a declaration. "I stand between two worlds, and I claim both." The sounds from inside carried through the night. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the polished tones of Granger's voice. River Hawk's jaw tightened. Among his people, women were sacred, not currency. The thought of a woman auctioned like cattle stirred a fury in him, as old as the land itself. He waited until the music swelled, until the laughter rose to its sharpest edge, and then he moved. Inside, Clara was led onto the raised platform at the front of the hall. A hush fell. Granger approached, a vision of wealth in his black suit, silver hair gleaming under the chandelier light. "Ladies and gentlemen," Granger began, voice smooth as velvet, "thank you for joining me on this momentous evening." He spoke of community, of progress, of alliances, and shared futures. But when his hand settled at Clara's waist, his real meaning was clear. Edward moved toward the platform, face taut with alarm, but Victor Hale blocked his path. Arms folded, a cold smirk on his lips. Granger's voice shifted, adopting a tone of generosity. "Of course," he continued, "it would only be fair to offer the young lady the best possible arrangement." His lips curved into a razor-thin smile. "Shall we begin the bidding at $5,000? A ripple ran through the room. Shocked murmurs, suppressed laughter, and then, unmistakably, the first bid. Clara felt her vision narrow, the crowd a blur of faces, the noise a distant roar. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her fingernails biting into her palms. She thought of her mother, of her father's worn hands, of the land that had shaped her into something stronger than anyone here realized. "I will not break," she vowed silently. "Not here. Not like this." Outside, the doors burst open with a crash like thunder. Every head turned as River Hawk strode into the hall, the flickering light catching on the silver in his hair, the beads at his belt, the dark fire in his eyes. Gasps rippled through the crowd, women drew back, men reached instinctively for hidden weapons. Granger's face contorted with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, motioning to his men. But Riverhawk's gaze never wavered from Clara. His voice cut through the room, calm and sure. 10,000, he said. A stunned silence followed. Clara stared, heart pounding, as realization dawned. The warrior from the ridge. The shadow on the horizon had come. Edward's voice broke through the chaos. Who are you to interfere in this? Riverhawk turned, dark eyes meeting Edward's, his voice quiet but firm. A man who remembers a debt. Victor Hale stepped forward, fingers brushing the grip of his pistol. You're not welcome here, Black Hawk. Riverhawk's lips twitched into the faintest smile. I've yet to meet a door I cannot walk through. He reached into his pouch and tossed it onto the nearest table. Gold nuggets spilled across the linen, bright, unyielding proof. Granger's face blanched. This is absurd. But the crowd, once so eager to laugh, had gone deathly still. Clara took a single step down from the platform, her silk skirts whispering across the polished floor. Her eyes locked on Riverhawk's, and for a heartbeat, the world fell away. Granger recovered quickly, snarling under his breath. Sheriff, arrest this man. The sheriff hesitated. Then, as if on cue, Judge Nathaniel Morris stepped through the doors, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. The judge's sharp gaze swept the room. Is this an auction I hear? Granger's face twisted, but his words faltered. The law had arrived, and the game had changed. Riverhawk bowed his head slightly toward Clara. No claim, he murmured. No chains, only honor. For the first time that night, Clara's breath came freely. The hush inside Clearwater's grand hall was so deep that even the chandeliers seemed to shiver in the still air. Clara stood frozen at the edge of the platform, her fingers twisting the edge of her emerald silk gown, the thrum of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Across the polished floor, Riverhawk met her gaze, dark eyes steady, a calm anchored in a storm of stares and murmurs. Granger's fists clenched at his sides. This is my event, he growled, voice low but edged with steel. My town, my rules. Judge Nathaniel Morris stepped forward, his black coat swirling as he turned toward Granger. You forget, Mr. Granger, that the law outranks ambition. I suggest you hold your tongue before you embarrass yourself further. A ripple of laughter, brittle and cautious, drifted through the crowd. Granger's face flushed crimson, but his thin smile returned as quickly as it had cracked. Very well, he murmured. A spectacle, then. Let the savage play hero. His gaze snapped to Victor Hale, who stood at the edge of the room, fists tightening. Victor, see that our guest knows his place. But Victor hesitated. The glint of the revolver at Riverhawk's waist, the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the bone-handled knife, it all spoke of a man who had walked through worse dangers than this. And the eyes of the room were watching now, weighing everything. Clara found her voice, soft but certain. This debt is settled. Granger turned sharply, his expression twisting with disdain. Is it? He hissed, his words just for her. Do you think this ends here, girl? A pouch of gold and a fool's promise. I will have what's mine. Clara's chin lifted, her grey eyes steady. I was never yours to begin with. Outside the hall, Edward stumbled into the cool night air, hands trembling. He sank onto the steps, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. How had it come to this? He had meant to shield Clara, to save the ranch, but all his plans had crumbled beneath Granger's weight. A shadow fell across him. Edward Bennett, Riverhawk said quietly. Edward looked up, blinking in the lantern light. For a moment his breath caught. The dark figure, the long hair, the feather, the faint scars, a man both familiar and foreign. You remember, Riverhawk murmured. Edward's brow furrowed, and then, like the sudden crack of a dry branch, it came back. The brutal winter, the starving band of Lakota near the tree line, the half-frozen child in Edward's arms, the food left near their camp. I remember, Edward whispered. Riverhawk inclined his head slightly. A debt of honor. The next morning at the Bennett Ranch, Clara walked the perimeter fence, skirts tucked up, hair braided, rifle slung across her back. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a sharpness that warned of early snow. She could feel it. The tension in the air, the weight of eyes watching from beyond the hills. Inside the house, Edward sat at the table, head bowed over a cup of coffee gone cold. He had barely slept. "We can leave," he muttered, when Clara came in, brushing dust from her sleeves. "We can pack up, head east, start over." Clara shook her head slowly. "No, Pi. This is our land. Mama's buried here. I won't run." Edward reached across the table, gripping her hand tightly. His eyes, once weary, now carried the spark of the man he used to be. "Then we stand together." By midday, Riverhawk rode up to the ranch, his horse moving with easy grace over the dusty ground. Clara met him near the well, where she'd been hauling water. Up close, he was both larger and quieter than she remembered, his presence like the hush before a storm. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said softly, glancing toward the tree line. "Granger will come looking." Riverhawk dismounted, his long black hair falling over his shoulders, the eagle feather glinting in the sun. "Let him." Clara's lips curved, despite herself. A wry half-smile. "You're either the bravest man I've met, or the most reckless." "Both," Riverhawk said, and the faintest grin touched his mouth. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded parchment. Clara took it, unfolding the document carefully, her breath caught. "A deed," she murmured, eyes flicking to his. "For the eastern parcel? Filed with the territorial office yesterday." Riverhawk confirmed. "It's in my name now." Clara's brows knit together. "Why?" He glanced toward the hills. "Granger wants your spring, with me holding the water rights. He loses his leverage." Clara's heart pounded. "But you put yourself in his path." Riverhawk met her gaze, quiet and unflinching. "It's already done." That evening, as the sun bled out over the prairie, Edward, Clara, and Riverhawk sat around the kitchen table. The lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. They spoke of boundaries, of agreements, of alliances born not from desperation, but from shared need. Outside, the first howl of a coyote rose on the wind. Inside, Clara felt the first fragile thread of hope stir in her chest. But far off, in the deepening dusk, a rider approached Clearwater's bank, slipping through the alleys like a shadow. Victor Hale dismounted, his face grim, his eyes sharp. Inside, Granger stood at the window, fingers steepled, watching the road west. "They think this is over," Granger murmured, voice cold as the prairie wind. "They've forgotten. I never lose." The morning broke cold and brittle across the Dakota plains. Frost rimmed the edge of the corral fence and glittered on the dry grass like shards of glass. Clara stood at the kitchen window, arms crossed over her chest, watching as Riverhawk and Edward walked the fence line, their breath misting in the air. It had been 3 days since the night at Clearwater's Hall, 3 days since the auction was shattered, and Granger's power checked. But Clara knew the calm was only surface deep. Inside, the house was unusually quiet. Clara's footsteps echoed softly on the floorboards as she moved about, preparing coffee, slicing bread, tending the fire. She caught herself glancing toward the door, half expecting trouble at every sound. When Edward and Riverhawk came inside, they stamped the cold from their boots, their conversation low and clipped. Edward offered Riverhawk a seat at the table, something that would have been unthinkable weeks before. Clara set down 3 mugs of coffee and gave Riverhawk a small, almost hesitant smile. He inclined his head in thanks, his long black hair loose around his shoulders, the eagle feather woven near his ear. Edward cleared his throat. "We need to make this formal. If the Lakota are to have water rights here, and we're to stand together, it needs to be more than a handshake deal." Riverhawk nodded slowly. "My people need safe passage, grazing ground, access to the spring. You need protection from Granger." "And the law?" Clara asked quietly. "Will it see it that way?" Riverhawk's mouth curved in a faint smile. "The law sees what it is forced to see." By midday, The yard was filled with quiet activity. Grey Wolf, the Lakota elder, arrived with two others, their ponies stepping lightly across the frozen ground. Edward met them with wary courtesy, leading them to the barn, where they could speak in peace. Clara worked near the porch, stacking firewood, her fingers stiff with cold. She watched the men from the corner of her eye, noting the careful gestures, the way they moved as if the land itself watched their steps. When she straightened, River Hawk was there beside her, quiet as the winter wind. "You're restless," he observed. Clara gave a soft laugh. "I'm a rancher's daughter. Stillness feels like a trap." River Hawk leaned a shoulder against the porch post, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You are not what they expected," he murmured. Clara turned to him, a spark of defiance in her grey eyes. "And what did you expect?" A pause. Then, softly, "Someone who would break." For a moment, the space between them was filled with something unspoken, something delicate and fierce, all at once. That evening, the council gathered in the Bennett kitchen. Edward, River Hawk, Grey Wolf, and the two other elders sat around the table. Clara poured coffee and set out bread, her movement steady despite the racing of her heart. They spoke of boundaries, of grazing routes, of water access. Edward pulled out the yellowed map of the ranch. River Hawk translated the words of his elders with quiet precision. "We will help repair the northern fence," Grey Wolf offered. "Our horses are strong. Our hands are ready." Edward gave a slow nod. "And you'll have the spring. The land there is yours by law now." River Hawk's dark eyes flicked clearer. "And by promise." Clara met his gaze, her heart thudding. "By promise," she echoed. In the shadows beyond the ranch, Victor Hale watched from the saddle of his grey horse, a pair of hired men flanking him. His lips curled into a sneer as he saw the flicker of lantern light in the Bennett house. "They think they're clever," he muttered. "They think a band of savages and a desperate rancher can stop Granger." One of the men spat into the dirt. "You want us to send a message?" Victor's eyes gleamed cold in the moonlight. "Not yet. Let them feel safe. A little longer. It makes the fall that much sweeter." That night, Clara stepped outside, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The stars spread overhead, fierce and cold and clear. She saw River Hawk near the eastern field, silhouetted against the moonlight, speaking quietly with Grey Wolf. She hesitated, then moved toward them, her breath curling in the air. Grey Wolf touched River Hawk's arm, murmured something in Lakota, and drifted away toward the camp near the trees. Clara and River Hawk stood in silence, the night stretching wide around them. "I never thanked you," Clara said softly, "for what you did in Clearwater." River Hawk's eyes flicked to hers, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "I did not do it for thanks." She hesitated. "Why then?" His gaze held hers steady. "Because what was happening was wrong, and because, years ago, your father saved lives when no one else would. My mother among them." Clara felt her throat tighten. She looked away, to the line of trees, the flicker of campfires, the shifting shapes of horses. "You're staying?" she asked, quietly. "For a time," River Hawk murmured. "The storm hasn't passed." "No," Clara whispered. "It hasn't." Inside the house, Edward watched from the window, a thoughtful expression on his face. He saw his daughter standing with the warrior, saw the way her shoulders squared against the cold, the way her head lifted when she spoke. His late wife's voice stirred in his memory. "She has your spine, Edward, and my heart." He turned away from the window, a quiet prayer on his lips, that whatever storms came, his daughter would have the strength to stand and the allies to help her rise. The wind had turned sharper overnight, biting at the skin and rattling the window panes of the Bennett farmhouse. Clara woke before dawn, pulling the heavy quilt tighter around her shoulders as she listened to the sounds of the house settling in the cold. Outside, she could hear the faint shuffle of hooves and the muted murmur of Lakota voices near the eastern camp. She rose quietly, braided her chestnut hair, slipped into her blue calico dress, and pulled on her boots. As she stepped out onto the porch, the icy air struck her cheeks, and she drew her shawl closer. Across the yard, Edward stood near the barn with Grey Wolf and River Hawk, their heads bent together in conversation. Clara moved toward them, her boots crunching in the frost. Edward looked up as she approached. "Morning, Clara," he said, his voice rough but steadier than it had been in weeks. "We were just discussing the north fence. Needs mending before the cattle drift." "I can help," Clara offered, rubbing her hands together. Riverhawk gave her a quiet nod. "You're stronger than most men I know." His dark eyes softened briefly, and Clara felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. By midday, the alliance between the Bennets and the Lakota was taking shape, in more than words. Men from both groups worked side by side, repairing fences, digging irrigation ditches, and clearing brush near the spring. Clara worked among them, sleeves rolled up, cheeks flushed from the cold, her laugh ringing out when Grey Wolf teased her about her stubborn determination. Edward watched from a distance. The weight on his shoulders lightened just a little. Yet even as the sun rose higher, trouble gathered in the shadows. In the town of Clearwater, Silas Granger sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes cold and calculating. Victor Hale stood across from him, the grin on his face sharp as a blade. "They're making alliances," Victor said, tipping his hat back. "Bennett and Blackhawk have the ranch humming like a beehive." Granger's lips curved into a thin smile. "Let them build. Let them dream." His fingers tapped against the polished desk. "We'll cut the legs out from under them when they're standing tallest." Victor leaned forward, voice low. "The men from Chicago arrived last night. They're waiting at the hotel, lawyers by name, enforcers by nature." Granger's eyes gleamed. "Excellent. We'll see if Bennett's deed holds up under a proper legal storm." That night, as Clara stepped outside to check the livestock, she paused on the porch, lifting her face to the wind. The moon hung low and heavy, its pale glow illuminating the hills. She had begun to recognize the silhouettes near the Lakota camp, the shape of Grey Wolf's shoulders, the long stride of River Hawk. She heard a faint sound and turned, only to see River Hawk emerging from the barn, brushing dust from his hands. "Couldn't sleep?" Clara asked softly. He shook his head, his long black hair shimmering faintly in the moonlight. "The air is uneasy." Clara folded her arms, looking out across the darkened fields. "You feel it too?" River Hawk nodded. "Danger often comes in silence before it comes in noise." For a moment, they stood side by side, listening to the quiet. "Tell me," Clara said suddenly, "about your mother." River Hawk's face softened. She was fierce, proud, stubborn as the river itself. "She taught me to walk the line between two worlds." Clara's lips curved faintly. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." River Hawk glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "I think she would have liked you too." Far beyond the ranch, under cover of night, Victor Hale and his men rode across the prairie, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. With them traveled the three men from Chicago, dressed in dark coats, their eyes sharp, their mouths set in thin lines. "We wait until the governor arrives next week," Victor said, his voice carrying on the wind. "That when the time comes, we strike hard and clean. No one challenges Granger and walks away standing." The next morning, a thin dusting of snow powdered the ground, the first warning of winter's approach. Clara worked beside Edward, hauling hay and checking the gates, her breath clouding in the crisp air. She looked up as River Hawk rode in from the east, his expression grave. "News from Clearwater," he said, swinging down from his horse. "The men Granger summoned, they're here." Edward's jaw tightened. "Lawyers?" "And guns," River Hawk confirmed. Clara felt her chest tighten, but she straightened her shoulders. "We've made our stand," she said quietly. "We'll hold it." River Hawk studied her for a long moment. "You are not what I expected, Clara Bennett." She smiled faintly. "You keep saying that." That evening, they gathered again at the kitchen table, Edward, Clara, Riverhawk, Grey Wolf, and the Lakota elders. They spoke of strategy, of legal defenses, of what could be saved and what could not. Clara listened quietly, her fingers folded around a mug of tea. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows as if the land itself was warning them, "Be ready." The wind swept across the prairie with a sharpness that cut through cloth and skin alike, driving the first true snow of the season across the hills and into the valley where the Bennett ranch sat. Clara stood on the porch, watching the flakes drift down like pale ashes, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The snow caught in her chestnut braid and dusted her lashes, but she hardly noticed. Across the yard, Riverhawk moved among the Lakota men, their ponies tethered near the barn, their shapes blurred by the falling snow. Grey Wolf crouched by a small fire, warming his hands, while the younger men checked their gear. The mood was quieter now, more watchful. They all felt it. The waiting, the storm, not of weather, but of men. Inside the farmhouse, Edward bent over the kitchen table, squinting at the ledger and the deed papers Clara had brought out. "We're legal on the spring, and on the eastern pastures," he muttered, tapping a thick finger against the yellowed parchment. "But Granger's men, they won't care about paper." Clara stepped inside, brushing snow from her shawl. "Then we stand by our word, with or without the law." Edward looked up at her, pride and fear mingling in his eyes. "You're braver than I ever was, Clara." She smiled faintly and squeezed his shoulder. "We'll get through this." By noon, Riverhawk joined them at the table, the fire crackling behind him, casting flickering light on his sharp features and the bone breastplate that gleamed faintly beneath his buckskin coat. He brought news from town. "The governor arrives in 3 days," he said quietly. "Granger's throwing a banquet. He plans to sign the ranch over, invalidate the deed, seize the land." Edward's face hardened. "He can't." "He will," Riverhawk cut in calmly. "Unless we show him we are not alone." Clara straightened, a spark lighting in her grey eyes. "What are you suggesting?" Riverhawk leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes steady. "We go to Clearwater, together, you and your father, the Lakota elders. We show the town what Granger fears most, a united front." The next day, preparations began. Clara worked side by side with Riverhawk, loading the wagon, packing supplies, checking the tack on the horses. She moved easily now among the Lakota, exchanging shy smiles and quiet words, finding herself surprised at how natural it felt. "Your people," she said softly to Riverhawk as they worked. "They don't look at me like I expected." He glanced at her, one brow raised. "And how did you expect them to look?" She hesitated, then smiled wryly. "Like I was the enemy." Riverhawk's lips curved faintly. "You are not the enemy, Clara Bennett. You are a woman standing between worlds." Her breath caught slightly at his words. She felt the weight of them settle in her chest, a strange mix of fear and pride. That night, the kitchen was crowded and warm, filled with the murmur of voices, the crackle of the fire, the scent of bread baking in the oven. Edward poured coffee for the elders. Grey Wolf spoke softly in Lakota, and Riverhawk translated with measured calm. "We are not here as saviors," Grey Wolf said, his voice rough but kind. "We are here as neighbors." Edward nodded, swallowing hard. "And I thank you for it." Clara sat quietly, watching her father's face, feeling the strange knot in her throat loosen just a little. For the first time in a long while, she felt something stir in the heart of their home. Not just survival, but hope. Outside, in the freezing dark, Victor Hale watched from the tree line. His men waited nearby, rifles slung across their backs, horses restless beneath them. He pulled a flask from his coat, took a slow drink, and smiled to himself. "Let them gather," he murmured. "Let them ride into town with their heads high. We'll see how high they hold them when Granger pulls the law down on their necks." In the small hours of the morning, Clara stood again at the porch railing, watching the stars burn sharp and cold overhead. She heard the soft tread of boots behind her, and turned to find River Hawk there, his breath misting in the air, his long black hair drifting in the wind. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. Clara shook her head, hugging her shawl tighter. "There's too much ahead, too much at stake." River Hawk stepped beside her, his gaze on the moonlit hills. "There is always something at stake, Clara. It is how we stand that matters." She turned to him, her heart beating faster. "Do you really think we can win this?" He looked down at her, his dark eyes solemn. "I think you are already winning, just by standing." For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind cold around them, their shoulders nearly touching, the farmhouse glowing faintly behind them in the dark. Inside, Edward watched from the window, his hand resting on the old rifle propped against the wall. He saw the two figures on the porch, his daughter and the warrior, and something inside him softened, even as the storm gathered on the horizon. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and whispered to the shadows, "Come what may." The sky over the prairie was a pale sheet of iron. As Clara loaded the last crate onto the wagon, snowflakes drifted in slow spirals, whispering against the canvas cover. Edward checked the harnesses, pulling the leather straps taut with hands that trembled only slightly. Beside the wagon, Grey Wolf and two younger Lakota riders mounted their ponies, their breath curling in the sharp dawn air. River Hawk approached on foot, his long black hair tied back, the eagle feather catching a flicker of light. His dark eyes met Clara's, a quiet reassurance there that steadied the storm inside her chest. "Clearwater waits," he said softly. Clara nodded, tucking a stray strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "So do we." The wagon rolled into town by late morning, iron wheels crunching over frozen ground. Townsfolk paused in the streets, watching the strange procession. The Bennett wagon, Edward at the reins, Clara beside him, followed by River Hawk and the Lakota riders. Granger's men watched from doorways, hats pulled low, hands twitching near holstered pistols. At the hotel, Silas Granger stood on the balcony, a silver-tipped cane in his hand, his narrow face split in a thin smile. Beside him, Victor Hale leaned against the railing, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Behind them, the three Chicago men waited, lawyers, enforcers, wolves in tailored suits. Edward guided the wagon to a stop in front of the courthouse steps. Clara stepped down, her boots landing firm on the packed snow, her gray eyes sweeping across the gathered faces. River Hawk dismounted in a fluid motion, his presence still and commanding at her side. The townspeople parted as the Bennett Lakota group moved forward, tension humming like a taut wire through the crowd. Inside the courthouse, Governor Henry Caldwell adjusted his spectacles and looked up from the papers spread across his desk. He was a thin, stooped man with sharp eyes, dressed in a thick wool coat that barely kept out the Dakota chill. Judge Nathaniel Morris stood nearby, his lined face solemn as he watched the doors swing open. "Governor," Clara said clearly, her voice carrying in the sudden hush, "we have come to answer the accusations Silas Granger has raised, and to stand for what's right." The governor gestured them forward. Come in, we'll hear it all." Granger swept in moments later, Victor at his shoulder, and the lawyers in tow. His voice was smooth, his words polished, but his eyes glittered with triumph. "These lands," Granger declared, "are improperly deeded, claimed under duress, held in violation of territorial law. I request immediate forfeiture." Clara's hands clenched at her sides. Edward stepped forward, placing a folded document on the governor's desk, the original deed signed and notarized. "We hold this land in honor," Edward said, his voice steady, "and with the help of our neighbors." River Hawk moved to stand beside him, saying nothing, but the weight of his presence filled the room. The governor leaned back, fingers steepled. "I've heard of you, Black Hawk," he said to River Hawk. "Half Lakota, half settler, a man with feet in two worlds." River Hawk inclined his head, dark eyes unwavering. "I stand where honor calls me." The room was silent for a long moment. Then the governor gave a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "Let the record show," he said softly, "that the Bennett claim stands, and any challenge to it must be made through legal channels, not hired guns. Granger's face paled. Victor's fingers twitched near his pistol, but the marshals at the door shifted, hands resting on their weapons. Outside, as the Bennett party stepped back into the cold, a sudden sound split the air. A shot. Chaos erupted. Clara felt Riverhawk's arm around her waist, pulling her sharply aside as another bullet cracked past. Edward shouted, dropping to his knees. Grey Wolf and the Lakota riders swept in, dismounting, weapons drawn. Across the street, Victor Hale raised his pistol, shouting orders to the hired men as townsfolk scattered in panic. Riverhawk moved like water, smooth, sure, unstoppable. His revolver was in his hand, his voice sharp as he barked to the Lakota in their language, driving the younger men into cover, shielding the governor's party as more marshals poured out of the courthouse. Clara pressed herself against the wagon, heart hammering in her chest, watching as Riverhawk stepped into the open, the pale braid of his mother's people swinging against his back. It was over, as quickly as it had begun. Victor was pinned beneath two marshals, his pistol wrenched from his hand. The Chicago men disappeared into the crowd like smoke, and Granger stood trembling on the hotel steps, his face bloodless, his plans crumbling in the snow. Clara stumbled forward, breathless, heart still racing. Edward caught her in his arms, his face pale but his voice steady. "It's done," he murmured. "It's over." But when Clara turned, it was Riverhawk she sought with her eyes. And when they met across the snowy street, something wordless passed between them. Not victory, not triumph, but recognition, and the ache of all that still lay ahead. That night, back at the ranch, the fire crackled in the hearth as Edward sat polishing his old rifle. Clara sat nearby, mending a tear in her dress, her hands shaking only slightly now. Outside, Riverhawk stood near the eastern fence, his breath misting in the cold, his eyes on the horizon. Grey Wolf joined him briefly, murmuring something in Lakota before slipping away to the camp. Clara watched from the window, her heart stirring in a way she hadn't expected, not with fear or with dread, but with something fiercer, something unnamed. The air was sharp as a blade, slicing through the stillness of the prairie night. At the Bennett Ranch, the quiet was uneasy, the kind that set horses stamping in their stalls and dogs pacing near the fence. Inside the house, Clara stood at the window, her chestnut braid loose over one shoulder, her grey eyes fixed on the moonlit hills. Edward sat in his old armchair by the fire, rifle across his lap, fingers drumming against the stock. "They won't let it end here," Edward murmured, his voice roughened by years of loss and hard-earned wisdom. Clara turned from the window. "No, they won't." Outside, Riverhawk walked the perimeter, his breath misting in the cold, his long black hair pulled back, the eagle feather trailing in the moonlight. Grey Wolf waited near the barn with two other warriors, their ponies tethered close, ears flicking nervously. "We'll post men at the eastern ridge," Grey Wolf said quietly. "If they come, it will be from that direction." Riverhawk nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. "Keep watch through the night. Tell no one to light fires." Clara emerged from the house, shawl wrapped tight, boots crunching in the frost. "Riverhawk," she called softly. He turned, his expression unreadable. She crossed the yard, stopping a few feet away. "Will they really come?" she asked. His dark eyes met hers. "Yes." Clara drew a shaky breath, then lifted her chin. "Then we'll be ready." Midnight came. The ranch lay cloaked in silence. The only sounds the soft creak of wood, the whisper of wind, the faint snort of horses in the dark. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, boots laced, rifle propped against the wall. Edward waited downstairs, every lamp snuffed except for the faint glow of the hearth. Outside, Riverhawk moved like a shadow, his hand brushing the pony's flank, his eyes on the black horizon. Grey Wolf crouched near the fence, murmuring to one of the younger men in Lakota. Then, a sound, faint at first, the crunch of hooves on frozen earth, the soft jingle of tack. Riverhawk straightened, His fingers lifted in a signal. Grey Wolf melted into the shadows. From the trees, Victor Hale and his men emerged. 5 riders, dark shapes against the snow, rifles glinting faintly in the moonlight. Behind them came 2 of the Chicago enforcers, their coats buttoned high, their faces hard. Victor raised a hand, and the riders fanned out. "Burn the barn," he hissed. "Drive the cattle. We'll see how long Bennett's pride holds when the wind's whistling through his walls." The first shot cracked through the night like a whip. Clara flinched upstairs, heart hammering. Edward rose from his chair in a smooth, practiced motion. Rifle raised. "It started," he murmured. Clara ran down the stairs, her rifle clutched at her chest. "I'm with you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Outside, Riverhawk moved fast, faster than Clara had ever seen. He leapt the fence, cutting across the yard toward the barn, his revolver drawn, his coat flaring behind him. Grey Wolf's men fired from the ridge, scattering Victor's group, sending the first 2 riders tumbling from their saddles. Victor snarled, wheeling his horse toward the barn. But Riverhawk was already there. They met near the corral, a sudden clash of fury and grit. Victor raised his rifle. Riverhawk slammed the butt of his revolver against it, sending the shot wide. They grappled in the dirt, boots slipping on frost, fists flashing in the moonlight. Clara burst from the house, rifle braced, heart pounding in her ears. She saw Victor and Riverhawk locked together, saw Edward moving through the dark, shouting to the Lakota warriors. And then, a shot split the night. Closer this time, Clara swung toward the sound, breath caught in her throat. One of Granger's hired men was charging, gun raised, and Clara didn't think. She only lifted her rifle and fired. The shot rang true. The man crumpled, his gun clattering to the frozen ground. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. When the last of the riders fled, when the fires were stamped out, when the horses calmed and the wounded were tended, Clara sank onto the porch steps, her rifle across her knees, her breath misting in the cold. Riverhawk approached slowly, his coat torn, a cut along his brow, his eyes soft despite the sharpness of the night. Clara looked up at him, a wry, exhausted smile tugging at her mouth. "We held," she whispered. Riverhawk crouched beside her, reaching out to touch her shoulder lightly. "You stood," he murmured, "like your mother, they tell me, like your land." Clara leaned into his touch for just a moment, her eyes closing. Inside the house, Edward watched from the window, his fingers resting against the glass, a quiet gratitude in his lined face. The Bennett ranch had withstood its storm, for now. The first light of dawn slipped over the prairie, soft and golden, washing away the shadows of the night. Smoke rose gently from the Bennett chimney, curling into the pale sky as if the house itself was exhaling, weary but unbroken. Clara sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a steaming mug, her chestnut hair falling loose from its braid, grey eyes rimmed with fatigue. Across from her, Edward nursed a bruised wrist, his eyes heavy but warm with pride, as he watched his daughter. "You were brave last night, Clara," he said softly. Clara gave a faint smile, though her hands trembled slightly. "I was terrified." Edward reached across the table, his fingers rough and calloused, his grip steady. "And you faced it anyway. That's the only kind of bravery that matters." Outside, Riverhawk leaned against the corral, his long black hair damp with melted snow, the eagle feather darkened by frost. He watched the sun rise over the hills, the golden light catching on the bone breastplate beneath his coat. Grey Wolf approached, his gait slow but sure, his lined face turned toward the horizon. "The girl," Grey Wolf said in Lakota, "she has the spirit of the prairie." Riverhawk smiled faintly. "Yes," he murmured, "she does." By late morning, the ranch stirred to life. Lakota men worked alongside Edward to mend the battered fence, hammering new rails into place, while Clara helped Grey Wolf tend the horses and check the water troughs. Children from the Lakota camp scampered through the snow, their laughter lifting the heavy air. For the first time in weeks, The ranch felt less like a battlefield and more like a home. In Clearwater, however, the mood had turned sharp and brittle. Silas Granger sat in his bank office, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the polished oak desk. Across from him, the three Chicago men leaned back in their chairs, their faces cold and unimpressed. "The law has turned against you," one of them murmured. "The governor sided with the Bennetts. Your claims have been dismissed." Granger's jaw tightened. "I made this town. They owe me." "They owe you nothing," another said flatly, rising to his feet. "The age of barons is passing, Granger. You'd best learn to bend before you break." The door swung shut behind them, leaving Granger alone in the fading afternoon light, his empire crumbling in his hands. 2 days later, a formal letter arrived at the Bennett Ranch, carried by a federal marshal. Edward unfolded it slowly, Clara leaning in over his shoulder as he read aloud. "Charges against the Bennett family withdrawn. The deed to the eastern lands upheld. The alliance with the Lakota recognized as lawful under territorial agreement." Edward let out a long, shaky breath. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer with a fierce, sudden relief. River Hawk stood quietly near the door, his dark eyes steady as Edward turned toward him. "We couldn't have done this without you," Edward murmured. River Hawk inclined his head. "No one stands alone forever, Edward Bennett." That evening they gathered in the barn to celebrate, a simple meal, shared laughter, and music drifting from a battered fiddle. One of the Lakota men had brought. Children chased each other through the hay, dogs barked joyfully, and Clara found herself smiling until her cheeks ached. She caught sight of River Hawk near the barn door, half shadowed by the fading light, his arms folded loosely, his mouth curved in a quiet, contented smile. Clara crossed to him, her dress brushing softly against the straw-strewn floor. "You'll be leaving soon, won't you?" she asked softly. River Hawk nodded, his dark eyes thoughtful. "For a time, but not far. My people need me." Clara's throat tightened. "And we'll miss you." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. A touch full of meaning, of promises too new to name. "I will return," he said simply. Later that night, Edward stood on the porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders, watching the moon rise over the hills. Clara joined him, slipping her arm through his. "It's strange," Edward murmured, "how a place can hold so much sorrow and so much joy all at once." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "It always has been." From the ridge, River Hawk watched the farmhouse glow in the moonlight, his silhouette still and strong against the pale sky. With a soft tug on his horse's reins, he turned toward the hills, the night swallowing his shape as he rode. The winter thaw came slowly to the Dakota plains, a reluctant surrender from frost to sunlight. The snow receded, leaving behind dark patches of earth, where green shoots fought to emerge. The Bennett Ranch, battered but unbowed, stood at the heart of it all, a quiet symbol of endurance in a land that tested every inch of a person's resolve. Clara stepped out onto the porch, a shawl wrapped over her blue calico dress, the braid of her chestnut hair slipping over one shoulder. She inhaled deeply, the scent of wet earth and promise filling her lungs. Edward emerged behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. His dark hair, streaked with grey, lifted slightly in the morning breeze, and though the lines on his face had deepened, his eyes were clear and steady. "We've made it through, Clara," he murmured. "You've made it through." Clara smiled, soft and slow. "We all did, hey." The ranch pulsed with quiet life. Lakota families moved through the fields, tending to horses and cattle alongside the Bennett hands. The sound of hammers rang out from the barn as repairs continued, and children's laughter drifted on the breeze from where they played near the stream. Clara worked alongside Grey Wolf that morning, helping repair a length of fencing. The old warrior chuckled under his breath as Clara hefted the heavy rails with practiced ease. "You have become strong, Prairie Girl," he said with a grin. Clara laughed, brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. "Not so much a girl anymore, Grey Wolf." He paused, studying her with warm, crinkled eyes. "No, Not anymore. As noon approached, a small dust cloud rose on the horizon, a figure on horseback riding toward the ranch. Clara shaded her eyes, heart lifting in a way that surprised her. River Hawk. He rode in with quiet ease, his long black hair loose in the breeze, the eagle feather at his temple trailing behind. His buckskin leggings and bone breastplate bore the faint marks of travel, but his dark eyes were warm as they met hers. Clara stepped forward, brushing her hands on her skirt. "You came back?" she said softly. River Hawk dismounted smoothly, his boots crunching softly on the thawed ground. "I said I would," he murmured. For a moment they stood close, the bustle of the ranch falling away, the air between them charged with something unspoken, something that had been building in every look, every word, every quiet moment shared by the fire. "I have news," River Hawk said, his voice low. "The council has agreed. We will build here, a village near the spring. We will share this land, if you will have us." Clara felt her chest tighten, a fierce joy blooming inside. "We would be honored." Edward approached then, his stride steady, his expression unreadable. He paused before River Hawk, looking him square in the eye. For a long beat, neither man spoke. Then Edward extended his hand. River Hawk clasped it firmly, and something shifted, not just between two men, but between two worlds. Spring unfolded slowly, tenderly. Clara found herself working alongside River Hawk, often in the fields, by the stream, helping the Lakota families set up their homes. They spoke of planting, of water rights, of cattle and horses, and sometimes, in the quiet hush of dusk, they spoke of themselves. One evening, as the sky blushed gold and violet, Clara sat on a fallen log near the edge of the stream, watching the sun slip behind the hills. River Hawk joined her, settling beside her without a word. For a while they sat in silence, the only sound the soft rush of water and the murmur of wind through the trees. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we can truly make this work? Two worlds, one land." River Hawk turned to her, his dark eyes warm. "We already are." Clara let out a long breath, her fingers brushing lightly against his where they rested on the log. He didn't pull away. On the day the governor returned, a crowd gathered near the courthouse steps. Edward stood tall beside Clara, Grey Wolf at his side, River Hawk just behind them. The territorial seal was raised high, and the governor's voice rang out, formal and sure. "Let it be recorded." Governor Caldwell proclaimed that the Bennett Ranch stands as a symbol of cooperation, a beacon of what this territory might become when neighbors stand together. The crowd erupted into applause, but Clara barely heard it. She felt River Hawk's presence at her side, his quiet strength grounding her, his gaze steady on the horizon. That evening, the ranch overflowed with music and laughter. A fire crackled in the yard, fiddles and drums blending in an easy harmony, and children darted through the tall grass under a sky awash in stars. Clara danced barefoot near the fire, her braid whipping behind her, her laughter ringing free across the fields. Edward clapped along from his chair. Grey Wolf smoked his long pipe with a contented grin, and River Hawk watched from the edge of the circle, his lips curved in a quiet, knowing smile. When Clara caught his eye, she beckoned. He hesitated, then moved forward, his hands finding hers, the rhythm of the drums pulling them into a slow, easy dance that spoke of old wounds healing, of futures waiting to be written, of two worlds meeting and finding at last something like peace.